Okay, welcome to another episode of the Regenerative Health Podcast. I am sitting down with a very special guest, Dr. Anthony J. Now, Dr. J is what I consider the world leader on the topic of endocrine disrupting chemicals and their effects on human health. Dr. J is the author of a fantastic book titled Estrogeneration that outlines the harmful effect that these chemicals are having on our biology, and is currently speaking and consulting on the topics of the harms of endocrine disruptors. So, Dr. J, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Max.
Cool. So, look, this is a topic that not a lot of people really know about, but I think it's having quite a significant effect in a bunch of ways on perhaps one of the most critical aspects of our human function, which is our ability to reproduce. So, what if you're able to give the listener a really brief overview of what endocrine disrupting chemicals are and how they are having broadly a negative effect on our biology?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the problems with these chemicals is they act like estrogen, they act like hormones in our bodies. And these are synthetic man made chemicals that our ancestors for thousands of years were never exposed to. And I say it's a problem right off the bat because they're not really toxic, right? Like if you have some cyanide or something and you put it in a dish that has some cells in it, it kills the cells, right? And so it's very obviously toxic. Or if you have some, I don't know, pesticide or herbicide, you can develop the toxicity on a little graph. The problem with a lot of these chemicals that I focus on is they don't appear toxic in conventional biological research. They look harmless, but they alter your hormones. They disrupt your hormones. They impact your sex hormones in particular. And that's obviously a problem, but it's hard to recognize that in our system, the toxicology system that we have set up.
Yeah, and I mean, for the listener, to give a really brief overview of the biology. I mean, I like to think of our sex hormones as a really finely tuned orchestra or symphony, and we need the right doses of estrogen and progesterone at the right time of the month to ovulate normally. We need testosterone, which is the male hormone in men, to be signaling and to signal adequately to develop as our sex characteristics, to develop it as men to produce high quality sperm. So these are hormones that are produced by our testes, by our ovaries, in response to signals from our pituitary gland and from our brain. And they, as you mentioned, Dr. J, they were for millions of years we've evolved them to be acting in a very specific way, and then man-made industry comes along and we contrive all these chemicals that have uses industrially and otherwise, but as you say, they're having an effect of disrupting this really finely tuned orchestra and therefore having an effect. Is that how do you think that's correct, or how do you
Oh
think
yeah,
about
man,
it?
that's perfectly stated. And these hormones, just natural levels of testosterone, estradiol, estrogen, progesterone, we measure them in nanograms, right? Sometimes picograms, like 10 to the minus ninth grams, so 0.000000001 grams. I mean, that's the unit of measurement. So these things are certainly fine tuned, and the concentrations are super carefully regulated, and nanograms per deciliter, right? In the American units. Now in Australia, they use more of the European units, but still, the point is super tiny doses. It's almost hard to imagine how small these doses are, and of course, that can get disrupted readily if you've got a soup of chemicals that you're being exposed to every single day. If it was just once a week or something, yeah, it's no problem, right? I mean, your body gets a little disruption and kind of bounces back from that. But the problem is it's not just every day, it's actually multiple chemicals every day. And that's what I focus on, because a lot of researchers, they only study one of the chemicals, and they develop 10 years of research surrounding just one endocrine disrupting chemical.
Mm.
That's fine for that scientist, right? Because it's interesting, and they give talks and lectures on it, and they stay in their academic bubble, they stay in their lane. But the problem is people like us that have kids or just want to live a healthy life or want to have energy and sex drive and fertility and not depression, not breast cancer, right? Breast cancer is up 250% since 1980.
Mm.
Fertility has been setting records, declining every year for infertility. We're setting records. So the point is, these things have a lot of impacts, and people like us that want to be healthy want to recognize, like, what are all the chemicals, not just one of them. We want to know the whole soup. And then we
Yeah.
can start to work on avoiding them. And sure, we're never going to be perfect because you're always going to have exposures in our modern culture, and that's okay. But at least we can do some obvious things. Part of it's just the recognition, right? Like once and this probably because once you started raising your own level of awareness around these chemicals, it changed the way you think about things.
Mm.
You're like, well,
And
I could buy this water, but this one's in plastic, this one's in glass. Well, I'm going to choose the glass. And 10 years before that, you may not have even thought of that.
yeah, and I'm really looking forward to diving in for the listener and explaining exactly which chemicals exist and where they're found. But I really want to emphasize that point that you made earlier, which is, if you dump a bunch of like paraquat, or someone drinks paraquat or cyanide, that is directly cytotoxic. It will directly kill the cell then and there. It's game over. Like the cyanide blocks your mitochondria's ability to function on a very very fundamental level, and that will kill the cell. But what Dr. J is saying is that this is like a hidden, like a trap. It's like a hidden time bomb almost. It's really insidious because the chemicals, these endocrine disruptors themselves, aren't necessarily killing the cell per se, but they're just simply putting that spanner in the works such that the organism in totality can't perform its normal endocrine and reproductive functions as normal. So it's very like insidious type of toxicity that we're dealing with here.
Correct. And it's at such a tiny dose. 50 years ago, we weren't even able to measure a lot of this.
Mm.
Um, and now we do, but we still don't have lab tests. People are always asking me, like, what's the blood test that I need to go to ask the doctor about to check for BPA or phthalates or parabens or whatever the thing? Well, they don't have them. They don't exist. They have them in research labs. We can do these research studies, and you'd be shocked by how many people. It's basically everybody. It's like over 95% of people have most, if not all, of the top 10 list in my book that I write about in their bloodstream at
Mm.
a surprisingly high dose. And
Mm.
not only do they go through your intestinal lining if you're drinking water that's in plastics or whatever, but they also go through your skin. And so we'll talk about all of that because, you know, just people, like I say, the recognition is the first step.
Yes, and I work in family practice, and I see patients, and commonly I'm seeing, often I see young women, and they're suffering from quite bad endometriosis or polycystic ovary syndrome. And I'm aware that there is evidence of associational evidence that people who have high rates of certain endocrine disrupting chemicals detected by in their urine or in their sweat have higher incidences or of these kind of reproductive problems.
Well,
So,
well,
um,
can I pause you there for a second
please,
and add something? Um, Now, in Australia, is the chemical atrazine legal, or is it
yeah,
illegal?
it is. It
It's
is.
legal.
It's being sprayed all over the canola here.
Yeah, same as America. Now, in Europe, like in Germany, France, Italy, whatever, it's completely illegal. But yeah, I thought so. I wasn't sure. But one of the interesting things about atrazine, and just for the listeners, atrazine is a herbicide. Like you were saying, they spray it on seeds and grains and canola, and especially in boggy areas where there's a lot of water, because it persists a lot longer on the plants than glyphosate, than Roundup. Roundup in America is the number one used herbicide, probably similar over there, and then atrazine is the number two used herbicide. Um, Now, the reason I'm bringing up atrazine, number one, it's a man-made artificial chemical. Number two, it acts like estrogen in our bodies. It disrupts our endocrine system, especially our testosterone. It lowers free and total testosterone. And number three, scientists use atrazine max to induce polycystic ovarian syndrome. If you want to study PCOS, you give a mouse a pretty high dose of atrazine and you get PCOS, and then they try and
Wow.
develop drugs to cure polycystic ovarian syndrome. And it's like, well, let's focus on preventing it from from the start instead of giving it the things and then trying to reverse it, right?
Incredible. And I mean, atrazine could be a podcast on its own, but I talked to an agronomist, David Bushell. For the listener, they can check out my earlier episodes. But there's a percentage of canola grown in Australia that's Roundup ready, so genetically modified, to be sprayed with glyphosate, and therefore withstand its toxic effect. But a proportion of non-GMO canola exists as
Mm.
well, and atrazine is very, very commonly sprayed
Yeah.
on that canola. It makes me wonder, and this is maybe there's so many tangents we could go on, but are you aware of atrazine residue persisting in through the refining process of canola into the finished product?
I'm not. I haven't checked that in a while. I'm sure it's in there.
Mm,
I'm sure it
mm,
persists, especially at the nanogram levels. But it's probably a surprisingly high persistence level. Um, but I don't know. I have not looked at the studies recently. It's been a while, you know.
yeah,
But
yeah.
it even persists in cow blood. Like when they do feedlot studies on cows, um, they find outrageous amounts of atrazine in their blood just from the corn. Because of
Mm,
course, with the feedlots, the purpose of the feedlot is to get the cow fat, so they give them as much corn as they possibly can. If a cow eats unlimited corn, they get bloated and they die. They can't handle just going from grass to corn, so they have to work them up slowly into more and more and more corn. And they do this at these giant feedlots, and they've checked they've checked the blood. And again, I mentioned this in my book. I have the specific numbers in my book, and it's like just as a reference, right? I don't remember the exact number, but it's I know very close to the exact. Like in humans, for me and you, Max, our testosterone, let's say, is probably about 700, and we'll just ignore the units for now. These are American units I'm using, but let's just say it's about 700, right? And the range is like 500 to 1500, or sometimes people say 300 to 1500, but whatever, right? We're about 700. Feedlot cows, atrazine levels were 700,000. They were over 700,000 in the equivalent
mm,
units. Does that make sense?
yeah,
Staggering, right? And that's just from
incredible.
eating corn. Now, of course, you could argue that canola, nobody's eating raw canola. They're using canola oil, or they're creating it and turning it into oil. So I don't know how much gets lost in the refining process. That's why I'm waffling a little bit on that specific thing, but I know it's in there, and I'm sure a lot of it carries, probably a surprising amount carries over.
Yeah, and people who are eating canola oil or using cooking canola oil to cook or eating out that been food that contains canola oil, there'll be other endocrine disruptors that I imagine have probably leached from the phthalates in the plastic bottle
Hmm.
into that oil.
Exactly. Exactly.
Um, so,
Yeah. Yeah. For
so
sure. That one's for sure. That one's not a question.
so whether or not the atracine's getting through, you're definitely being exposed to other forms of endocrine disruptors, which are that are these are the phthalates lipophilic or fat
Oh
soluble?
yeah.
Is that
Oh, for sure.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah.
phthalates are a category of molecules that, once again, they disrupt your endocrine system. They particularly mess up your testosterone, and they act like estrogen in certain cases. The problem with phthalates and parabens, by the way, and they're both found in fragrances, and phthalates are especially used in plastics, but they're actually a category of molecules, so they're not just one thing. So it'd be a lot easier if it was just phthalates, right? If phthalate was just one thing, or if parabens were just one thing. But there's methylparaben and propylparaben and butylparaben, right? There's all these there's hundreds of different parabens, and there's hundreds of different phthalates. And then once they get into your system, your body breaks them down into metabolites that can also disrupt your hormones. And then
Mm,
it's another layer of complexity. And then the question is, well, have we studied the metabolites? And the answer is no, because we haven't even studied the original parent compounds in most cases, right?
mm,
Because there's so many of them. They kind of study the top one or two, and those one or two are, of course, disconcerting. They're very scary in terms of what they do to long-term health. And it's sneaky. It's just like disrupting your hormones a little bit over a long period of time. You're not going to pick it up in a 6-week study, and it's not toxic, but all of a sudden you see weight gain, and you see depression, and you see, infertility, like we're talking about breast cancer, low testosterone for men, and on and on. And even immune system dysfunction and blood clotting issues get amplified with some of these chemicals. So there's a lot of very specific health issues that you can watch for, but most of those don't happen overnight. And most of the studies have not, they haven't accounted for a lot of that because there's such short-term studies.
Yes, and look, what you're saying is really reminiscent of a talk I did with Tucker Goodrich on seed oils,
Mm.
and he was making the point that the exact same case exists with the breakdown products of linoleic acid, which is
Hmm.
the polyunsaturated fatty acid in most seed oils that can vary in percentages, but is one of the chief proofers in these oils. And their breakdown products, the ones that we know a lot about, like 4-hydroxynonenal and the HODE type compounds, they're toxic. But as you say, there's ongoing breakdown of the compounds themselves, and the toxicity exists, all the way down, and we just simply haven't got our heads around the exact toxicity of those metabolites and perhaps how they're interacting with other compounds in the body. So it really points to this idea of insidious, long-term, cumulative damage and harm that's being done by exposure to things like these endocrine disrupting chemicals. Um, Before we leave atrazine, I wanted to make the point that, as far as I was aware, the initial discovery of the endocrine disrupting effect of atrazine, the chemical, was in animals, because they noticed that in wild animals, I believe it was in the US, maybe perhaps alligators or other forms of amphibians were having reproductive problems and were developing agenesis, or
Hmm. Sex
altered
changes.
sex changes in with their sex organs. Is that
Hmm.
correct?
Yeah, because those animals live in the water. So atrazine,
Mm,
especially with frogs and animals that live in water, absorb a lot more through their skin just constantly. And
mm.
and it's, again, surprisingly low doses. You can convert a male frog into a female by just having them in water that has atrazine, and it's unbelievably low doses, like to the point where it's almost undetectable. But
Wow.
yeah, but it does alter the reproductive organs, and sometimes it's not as dramatic as changing a male into a female. Sometimes it just changes the way their brain works, or sometimes it shrinks the male or sex organs a little bit, or something like that, right? Anogenital distance is what Shanna Swan does a lot of research. I don't know if you've heard of her with their book, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that, and they used to call it male feminization in scientific research. They would call it male feminization, and now it's politically incorrect, so nobody wants to touch it. Nobody wants to talk about it. And I talk
Mm,
about it publicly all the time, but I'm fairly independent. Most
mm,
scientists that I talk to that have PhDs and do research on this, they don't want to talk publicly about it, but they're happy to tell me, like, of course this is happening. Of course this is a huge problem. And of course this is chemical by nature. And, you know, and that's what you see in the culture in the past 20 or 30 years, right? I mean, if you're measuring testosterone levels, you see them declining. And once again, it's not just atrazine, it's not just phthalates, it's not just parabens, it's not just, you know, methylbenzaldine camphor in the sunscreens, or the avobenzene, or the benzene compounds in the sunscreens. There's the
yeah.
soy, right? There's so many things. And when they do these studies with soy, just, I know it's a little off topic, but soy is another one that acts like estrogen. All the scientists agree it acts like estrogen. Nobody debates that. What they try and debate is whether it's good for you or bad for you. But everybody agrees it's acting like estrogen, in some cases disrupting your hormones. But the problem is, our bodies are so awash in all of these chemicals, it's hard to see the difference.
Mm,
Like, if you're in most civilization, you've got so much plastic in your system, and you put a little extra soy in there, it's like, well, it's pretty negligible in terms of the effects. But if you go up to Alaska and you find some native tribe, like the Eskimos or something, you don't it's basically unethical to start dosing them with these plastic chemicals, right?
mm,
um, and then if you or giving them soy isn't necessarily unethical in that case, but those are the kind of studies you'd probably want to see. But then you could argue, well, soy is not something that their ancestors did in that particular culture, so then there's the cultural genetics that come into play. So it's kind of complicated. So and nobody's willing to do those kind of studies anyways, but that's the kind of study you almost have to do to see these effects. You have to take out all the other ones, but most scientists aren't, they're not recognizing the soup. They're just
Yes.
recognizing one chemical at a time and researching one chemical at a time, because you spread yourself pretty thin. In research, most people focus on one thing. That's what you get your funding for. That's what you spend your life focusing on. You don't become an expert in 10 chemicals. You become an expert in one family of chemicals or something. So it's
Mm.
challenging. You see that the research can be hard, but my philosophy on a lot of this is, look, we're definitely, everybody agrees, we're definitely overexposing ourselves to too many of these endocrine disrupting chemicals, you know, and and soy definitely acts like estrogen. Let's not add another one. Like, let's not continue to amplify our estrogenic response in our body, right? That's
Ye-
my philosophy. Now, if people disagree and they want to do a lot of soy, that's okay. In fact, I don't, if people want to drink out of plastic, that's fine as far as that goes. I'm just not going to do it, you know, and I do think there is long-term effects to that kind of behavior, but people can still do what they want to do. I'm not going to force them to make these kind of decisions, but I at least want to raise awareness that, well, here's what I think, and I've done a lot of research on this, so take it for what it's worth.
Yes, and I like it that you brought up the soy example, because what it's illustrating is that there's multiple sources of endocrine disrupting chemicals. So there's soy is obviously a food source of endocrine disruptor, and it's a phytoestrogen, meaning that it's a chemical that's a plant based estrogen. But we're obviously also getting endocrine disrupting chemicals from food via plastics, which are ingested. They're obviously synthetic. There's also pesticides, and then there's also a range of other chemicals. So I mean, let's. I know it can sound overwhelming for the listener, but maybe if we go through, maybe if we start at the most common one, because most people have probably heard of BPA, and they've probably looked down at their Nalgene water bottle and see that it says BPA free, and they have an intuition that that's a good thing. But maybe you'll just talk to us a little bit about bisphenol A and why that's the most well known one and what that effect it has.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, BPA was developed in the 1920s by a guy named Charles Dodds, I think. Dodds, I believe. I can't remember for sure his name, but he developed it from a compound called diethylstilbestrol. It's the acronym is DES, DES, and he developed BPA as birth control. That was his interest. That's what he was doing. It acts like estrogen. Let's make it a birth control and make a bunch of money on it. But then they found other compounds like 17 alpha ethinyl estradiol that works better as birth control. So they switched gears and used that. But then they also discovered that BPA can turn into plastic. If you link these molecules together, it's called a polymer instead of a monomer. A monomer would just be one molecule. A polymer would be a chain of them together, of course. And what they spent decades doing publicly is telling people and convincing people that this does not leach. These BPA molecules are all linked together. They're polymers, they're not monomers. So they don't leach. It's okay. You can drink out of the water bottles and all this kind of thing. Well, and then they finally started doing research into it. And of course, this is 30 years into having these plastics readily available and publicly available. And by the way, some people still have these plastic bottles. If you look on the recycling symbol in the bottom of the bottle and it says number 7, that's probably BPA. There's a few other options, but most of 99% of the time, that's BPA. So, anyways, when they finally started measuring the leaching, you know, they find, oh, everything has it's leaching. It's leaching. Sure, it's polymers, but when you're making a polymer, you're always going to have free monomers in there. You know, you're always going to have a few existing single molecules of BPA that end up leaching into the plastic, and that's what they find. And of course, they have major health ramifications. Like, for example, even children that have more BPA in their urine have extremely high levels of depression compared to children with zero BPA or low BPA in their urine. And that's a problem because children aren't supposed to have depression across the board. Like a 5-year-old kid or a 10-year-old child shouldn't really have depression. Um, they don't have car payments and stress, and everything should be fresh and happy. You know what I mean? It's just,
Yeah.
it's super sad when you see it in children, and that's what you see with more chemical exposure. So some of this stuff, it may or may not cause depression, but it may dispose you higher to depression, right? It may increase the disposition. But and that's true of all of these endocrine disrupting chemicals, by the way. It's just like postpartum depression. Like I always like to use the analogy of pregnancy because, like sometimes if you think about natural hormones and disrupting those processes, like for example, when women become pregnant, they gain a lot of weight. And it's not just a 10-pound baby, it's a lot of fat, is extra fat. And that's good storage, that's energy storage. And the same thing happens when you are altering your metabolism through these chemicals, you increase weight, and it alters your natural levels and this delicate balance that you have. And a lot of people gain a lot of weight and they can't figure it out because they're told it's just about calories, but it's not just about calories. Their hormones are all messed up. And so that's another reflection of pregnancy, or or a disruption of that process, or kind of a bastardization of that process, or something, a perversion of that process. And the same thing with postpartum depression. You throw your estrogen for a loop, suddenly you have depression. And the same thing can occur with a lot of these chemicals. And I know I'm getting off topic of BPA a little bit far, but anyways, BPA, what the companies did after it became just so apparent that it's terrible for you that they couldn't deny it anymore, they switched to BPS or BPF or different analogs, similar compounds to BPA that are just as bad. But they're just playing
Yeah.
alphabet soup. They're just modifying the molecule a little tiny bit, kind of like they do with steroids in athletics. They make the molecule just slightly different so it doesn't get picked up on the drug test.
Yes. Yes, it's a sleight of hand by these manufacturers, because there was obviously a massive ad campaign, and it entered the public awareness that BPA was bad. So the bottled branding simply just says BPA free, but it's made of plastic still, and it's made with a modified molecule that is acting chemically in the same way as BPA structurally. That's why the water bottle holds water. And they're trying to or obscuring or not disclosing the fact that the BPS, or the variation on BPA, is actually having the same endocrine disrupting capability as the original compound that they're supposed to be replacing it with.
Yeah.
So, so that's something for people to be aware of, which is, um, and maybe at the end of this discussion we can talk about actionable advice, but essentially not drinking from any form of plastic water bottle is always going to be the safest option.
Yeah.
I want to emphasize a point that you made in terms of the mechanism of action of these endocrine disruptors, and what Dr. J said is that when obviously when a woman becomes pregnant, they physiologically put on a heap of weight, and that has a range of evolutionary advantageous reasons, probably because the women who didn't store a lot of fat and underwent a short fasting period or war, famine, died and weren't able to pass on their offspring. So there's obviously an advantage to putting on weight during pregnancy. But what Dr. J is saying is that if you're ingesting BPA and other chemicals through plastic water bottles, through plastic contact with your food, then you're simulating, or you're giving your body the signal of being pregnant when it isn't, and you're giving it a signal of pregnancy from an artificial source. And what that means is that you might be putting on weight, not only by what you're eating, but what is contaminating your food. Because when I first started this podcast, we are talking about the effect of processed foods and refined sugar and carbohydrates and seed oils, and they very much contribute to weight gain. But the fascinating thing that you're saying, Dr. J, is that if someone is ingesting BPA or an endocrine disruptor, that might be an additional reason why they're having hard to shift weight.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it for sure is. Yeah. In fact, you can do these animal studies, and I've done them, and I've seen research. And of course, I cited this specific study in my book, but my favorite study is a rat study where they had two groups of rats, and they gave them the exact same calories. Now, you can't really do this with people because people cheat on their diet and they don't tell you, and they're not very honest. They're eating ice cream at night or something. But yeah, so with animals, you can literally give them the exact same calories, exact same environment. The only difference between the two groups of rats was one of the groups, they had low dose atrazine in their drinking water. So it kind of goes back to the atrazine discussion we had. And the reason I emphasize low dose is because this is the type of dose that people get in their drinking water if they live near fields that are being sprayed. It wasn't some
Mm.
crazy high toxic dose or something like that. They were trying to imitate just the hormone disruption that humans actually get. And what they found was the group of rats, again, same calories, the group of rats that had the atrazine, they were obese. They gained a bunch of weight. The other ones were totally normal. And sure, maybe if you cut the calories in that atrazine group, at some point they're going to lose weight, and at some point they're going to look similar if you starve them, but then they're going to be tired all the time, right? And it's just not going to be good for them. When instead of focusing on the calories in a situation like that, you should be focusing on the hormones and the endocrine disruption.
Mm. Yeah, no, it's fascinating, and look, there's so many overlapping and kind of interwoven issues here, and the delivery, as we mentioned about the canola oil and the phthalate chemicals that are leaching into it, is
Mm-hmm.
that so commonly it's people are getting triple, quadruple whammy. They're drinking the water with the atrazine, they're eating the deep fried donuts and fries in seed oil that's obesogenic in itself, rich in linoleic acid and 4-HNE, and then they're getting the phthalates. So, and then they're under blue light and they've got a disrupted circadian rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
So we're just emphasizing, or I like to emphasize how there are so many overlapping factors that are contributing to people's poor health, and
Yeah.
this is just
And,
simply another one of them.
and the research too, the confounding variables in the research oftentimes that are overlooked is the plastics. So sometimes you
Mm.
see these scientific studies on olive oil, and they say, look, it's terrible for you. It's causing all these problems in these animal studies. And then they have other studies that say, look, it's amazing for you. It causes all these health benefits and no problems. And it's like, well, what's the difference? Well, they usually don't reveal this in the studies. You can't find this level of nuance in the actual study. But if you work with animals like I do, and like I have for decades, like mice studies and rat studies and rabbit studies and all this, you realize a lot of the researchers you bringing in plastic tubs of olive oil, and then other ones are just going to the
Mm.
store and buying glass vials of it. And there's not a lot of consistency there, and there's not a lot of openness about where they're getting their sources and what containers these are in, because that's a variable and it's an important one. And I think that modifies a lot of the research. It changes the results on some of these studies.
Yes, yes, and I wanted to go back to, you mentioned Dr. Shanna Swan, and she wrote a great book called Countdown, which describes the various effects of different endocrine disruptors on human fertility. So obviously, we're making the point a lot in terms of animal studies, but for the listeners out there who are thinking, okay, but what about in humans? What one point I would say is that the endocrine system in mammals is highly conserved. So if you're getting endocrine disruption in a mouse study, then that's very applicable in my mind to humans. But the work of Dr. Shanna Swan, looking at basically the distance between the anus and the, I believe it is at the base of
Genitals.
the
Yeah.
genitals, yeah. So the
Hmm.
distance, that perineal distance, is affected in women, sorry, in children whose mothers have various types of endocrine disruptor exposure, and then they correlated that to the fertility of that offspring of that child later in life. So that was a very interesting. She's done very interesting research to prove that, or highly suggest that the ingestion or the exposure of these chemicals in humans during pregnancy affects fertility later in life. And you mentioned diethylstilbestrol as the precursor chemical to BPA. That's basically the archetypal endocrine disruptor in the medical field, because that caused that it was basically used, I believe, in the between the late 50s and even up to the early 70s or mid
Hmm.
70s maybe.
Yep. Yep.
For what was the indication? Was it preterm? I can't.
Eclampsia for a little bit, but some of it was just morning sickness, so it was very common.
Ah, yeah, okay. And essentially, what it caused was what's known as a incredibly rare vaginal clear cell adenoma, adenocarcinoma, which is an incredibly rare type of vaginal cancer in the women, the daughters of the women who took it during pregnancy, which was unheard of prior to the use of this drug. And I believe that subsequent generations have also had reproductive abnormalities, indicating a transgenerational effect of
Yep.
these drugs. So maybe you could talk a little bit quickly about this idea of epigenetics and transgenerational effects, because I think
Hmm.
that is a topic that is incredibly interesting and relevant that no one's really mentioning.
Yeah, for sure. And by the way, Shanna Swan wrote her book in 2021. Mine was in 2017, and I cited some of her work.
Oh wow.
So she mostly focused on phthalates, and I focused on phthalates and 9 other chemicals, right?
Mm.
Um, but she talks about the epigenetics. I do too. I spent a whole third of my book, a whole third of it was on epigenetics. And the analogy I like to use for people that don't understand epigenetics is musical notes. Because if you have a melody for a song, in America, Mary Had a Little Lamb, that's just your genetics. That's just very basic. You can pass that to somebody else. They play the same song. Um, it's not super complicated. But epigenetics would be when you add notes on top of those notes, right? So you add chords or you add other instruments or something. So you still have the same melody. The DNA is still there, but now you have other notes. And technically, the definition of epigenetics is marks on the DNA.
Mm.
That's the old school definition. I mean, it's a little more complicated than that, but it's physical marks on the DNA, usually methylations or ubiquitinations or summolations or something. It's physical chemical marks. And sometimes it's marks on the histones or sometimes it's marks on other things too that get passed on. But the point is just think of it as musical notes. The melody is the DNA, the epigenetics are the other notes on top of those notes. Um, again, the most important thing is that gets passed on. You can pass that on. And that's changing. Your DNA doesn't really change. The epigenetics definitely changes all the time. So you can actually pass on better epigenetics or you can pass on worse epigenetics. And and I think the other thing that's interesting that hasn't really been proven yet, but it's super interesting, is the epigenetic marks are usually on the letter T, I believe. They're on one of the specific base pairs. And that's the base pair that gets mutated the most frequently. And I think
Mm.
epigenetics drives a lot of long-term mutations, meaning initially it's just epigenetics. It's just marks on the DNA, but eventually it turns into actual genetic change. Does that make sense?
Mm.
So again, that's a bit
Yeah.
of a hypothesis. It's not super well proven, but Michael Skinner has done a lot of research in this area. He's out in Washington University, and he gave a talk on epigenetics, like a TED talk. And we've talked about this a lot over the years. And again, I forget the specific detail, the specific base pair, but he knows all this information. But and again, it's just a hypothesis. But I think if you keep hammering an epigenetic change, you keep changing the mark on your DNA over and over and over, that certainly increases the likelihood of an actual mutation. And that
Mm.
mutation can literally ingrain that epigenetic mark into the long-term DNA. Because the difference
Yes.
between epigenetics and genetics is the genetics, it's much more thousands of years scale, whereas the epigenetics is more decades.
Yes. Yeah, and I mean the way I think about epigenetics is it's a way that we evolved making changes to increase the likelihood that our children and our descendants would be able to survive in the environment that we are currently living in. So
Hmm.
obviously our genetic code can't change generation on the short time scale of 1 or 2 generations, but if we get exposed to a heap of certain environmental changes or certain amounts of foods or different nutrient profiles, that causes epigenetic changes so that our children are better equipped to survive in the world that they're coming into.
Yeah. Yeah.
The
Have you?
problem,
Oh
sorry, go
well,
on.
have you ever heard of that mouse study where they did with the rose smell or the rosebud smell?
No.
Yeah, just to illustrate exactly what you're talking about, they had these mice, and this is a little bit unethical, but they had mice where they gave they gave them electric shocks if they smelled rose flowers, like rose essential oil or something. Um, and then if they didn't smell it, they didn't give them electric shocks. And literally several generations later, those baby mice that weren't even given electric shocks, there was only one generation given electric shocks when they would give them rose, hit them with electric shocks. Next day, they would give them a smell, this essence of rose, the smell of roses or something like this, electric shocks. And then that was it. And then literally several generations later, the mice that were, when they would smell roses, they would have a cortisol response. They would have a stress response from smelling roses, zero electric shocks for several generations.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely incredible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it does impact our ability to transmute changes through generations, right? To basically communicate important changes through multiple generations without the DNA physically changing.
I mean, it's so incredible, and it explains things like multi generational traumas, and you can
Mm-hmm.
imagine how emotional stress would also leave an epigenetic mark on
Mm-hmm. Yep.
subsequent generations. But what it also is relevant for is endocrine disruption, which
Mm-hmm.
is, as we talked about, if you're exposed to diethylstilbestrol or perhaps even the combo of phthalate and BPA and atrazine that most people are probably getting today in Australia or in America, then what are you doing for that child or your child's child ability to reproduce? Are you I mean, I would suggest, and maybe you would too, Anthony, that child is going to have a legacy of fertility issues because of the exposures of their grandparent or their great grandparent.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And they're going to blame themselves, right? Unless they're educated on this, which is frustrating because, a lot of times the grandparents are healthier than the offspring in these animal studies when you have these exposures. And so if the grandparents say like, "Hey, I used to drink out of plastic all the time. I used to do fragrances all different types of weird chemical fragrances that were artificial, synthetic, and I was fine, right? So look at me, therefore I'm fine. You should be fine. Something else is wrong with you, right?" That's usually kind of implied, and in reality, it can amplify in the future. And the other thing about epigenetics in the relation in the context of sex hormones are unique compared to a lot of hormones. Like if you have insulin or something, which is a hormone, it doesn't go into the cell. It sticks to receptors on the outside surface of the cell, and then those receptors get triggered and amplify a response inside the cell, but it never goes in the cell. Whereas testosterone, it actually goes into the cell. That's unique, right? Estrogen goes into the cell. Progesterone, like sex hormones, go inside the cell, first of all, right? And a lot of
Mm,
hormones don't do that. And number two, they don't just go into the cell, Max, and I know you probably know this, but they go into the nucleus. The nucleus has its own membrane. Our cells have a membrane around them. I always call it a pillowcase. But our DNA actually has its own pillowcase. It has its own membrane, and almost nothing goes in there. Like that's a really stringent area that you don't want to be messing with. So the cells don't allow anything to go in there hardly. But estrogen, testosterone, sex hormones go into the nuclear membrane. They go through that membrane, meaning they're particularly impactful for epigenetics. They're right there. They're acting on your epigenetics in a direct way instead of an indirect way through the outside of the cell. They're right in there. And so,
mm,
of course, you're going to expect to see a lot more dramatic epigenetic changes when you start manipulating sex hormone levels, start altering sex hormones of any type. And it goes back to that delicate balance that your cells are expecting, and then you're disrupting that. So that's honestly the biggest red flag in my whole book, and my whole focus when I talk is to focus on, look, it's not just me and you, it's future generations amplifying this response. And that's a lot sneakier. Number one, it's sneaky because it doesn't look toxic. Right? If you do research studies, it doesn't even seem toxic. So you get the governments and things saying, look, it's not even toxic. So that reassures people. So then people are doing that. And then number two, nobody's talking about the multi-generational impacts, which are even more problematic because they're even more sneaky. And anytime you have something sneaky with humans, it's usually ignored.
yeah.
Unless your house is burning down, you pretty much ignore the problems that are long term. It's just human nature. Unless you're very well educated or you're highly motivated in relation to your health or your ancestors, right? You want to pass off good genes or whatever. You're really motivated. It's difficult, man. It's a challenge.
It's so fascinating and so insidious because, as you said, it's not something that's obvious enough that people are jumping up and down about, but it's truly kind of civilization ending problem. It's like a slowly creeping, poison, and just attacking that fundamental ability to reproduce. I'll just share an analogy that I use as well for epigenetic harm, and it was one that I came up with, or that a friend of mine came up with, which was, imagine if you got a tattoo um, on your shoulder, and then when you had a child, a baby,
Mm.
that kid came out with a tattoo on it, and but not only like you might just get a tattoo on your shoulder, but what if the baby came out with a sleeve tattoo,
Wow.
and
Yeah,
then
man.
his baby came out with full body tattoos.
Oh my gosh.
Like that's a visual analogy for people to think about epigenetic harm, because what Dr. J and what we're both saying is there's evidence of cumulative epigenetic harm. So it's like the genome's taking a battering on the first generation can handle it, and the second generation, this decreasing, and third generation decreasing ability to um there's less and less insult needed to provoke more and more disease, I
Yep.
think.
Yep. Well,
So
in the tattoo example is especially funny because the positive side of this whole thing is we can alter our epigenetics in a positive way, right? So if you use a sauna, for example, that improves your sex hormones, right? Um, you get out and exercise, that improves your sex hormones, improves your epigenetics, and you're passing on better epigenetics. And the irony with the tattoos is, if you get out in the sunshine a lot, tattoos fade away. Sunshine helps to
mm,
break down tattoo ink, and so you can make an argument that, look, you can erase these tattoos, right? Even though they're getting
mm,
larger, you get out in the sunshine and break that ink down, and your body breaks it down. Your body doesn't see it as a positive thing to have a tattoo. It sees it as a toxin, basically. Sunshine helps to clear that, break it down in smaller pieces, and helps your body flush it out. So you can do that too. But it always starts with avoidance, right? Like when we talk about practical ways to, to kind of work around these chemicals, I would say just classify plastics as most likely problematic. Sure, there's some plastics out there that exist that don't have estrogens. You can find like plastic number 5 and things like that. And some of them are made from corn and they are estrogen free. It just costs a little bit more, so most companies don't use these. So just generally be skeptical of plastics, especially liquids in plastic. People are always asking me, "What about this food and what about that food?" It's like, hey, if it's a solid, it's a solid food in a plastic, it's fine. There's no leaching in solids. It's the
mm,
liquids, especially the oils. If you have oils that are in plastic, there's much more leaching than in just regular water. And if you heat it up, it's even worse. You see, so there's a scale, there's a grade or a gradient. But plastics are always a problem. And then the fragrances. I always tell people, look, you got to change your personal care products. Most of these fragrances are nonsense. They're full of petroleum based artificial chemicals that disrupt your hormones. Some of them haven't been studied at all. So I'm just hypothesizing here, but some of them have been well studied and they're definitely endocrine disrupting, right? And so fragrances and filter your drinking water. That's how you start, you know?
yeah.
I
Yeah,
think
no, great.
it's simple. Hmm.
Yeah, great points. And I like to take patients. I'll open up. There's a great website called EWG, and they've
Hmm.
got
Yep.
a database where you can put your care products in, and get a rating out of 10 about the presence of nasty, harmful chemicals.
Yep.
And look, you can type in something, a very, very common fragrance that many young women would be wearing, like, I don't know, Marc Jacobs Daisy or something like this. And you put it in the database and it's got a 10 out of 10 rating. It's red, red, red warning
Hmm.
signs. And because it contains phthalates, they've got, and I believe the phthalate is being used as an artificial fixative for the fragrance.
Hmm. Yeah.
Previously, they used whale vomit back in the day, um, but that was too expensive. So they found a synthetic version, and it's potently endocrine disrupting.
Yeah. Yeah. And they use it as a cheap filler too, because it's petroleum based. So that you can buy like truckloads of this stuff for next to nothing. You can buy
Mm,
kilograms of it for
mm,
hardly anything. So they oftentimes will tell you that it's a fixative or that it carries the fragrance further in the air or whatever kind of, and it probably does a little bit, but at the end of the day, mostly these companies are trying to make money. And so they're using
mm,
these products because they're cheaper. So it does cost more if you love fragrances and you want to be all, have a lot of fragrances in your whatever laundry detergents and your deodorants and then your shampoos and all. Be careful. A lot of those you have to spend more money. It's just the way it is. I just go fragrance free most of the time. With almost everything. That's a very safe way to do it. And the other thing is sunscreens are usually a problem. There's a lot of problematic sunscreens. There's good ones out there. They do exist. like zinc sunscreen, perfectly fine. But a lot of sunscreen has has estrogen mimicking chemicals. Um,
Yes, yeah, and look, I believe Hawaii banned sunscreens, oxybenzone sunscreens, because
mhm,
the reef was
exactly.
dying.
Yep. Yep.
Not because it was harming human health, but because people were swimming with these sunscreens on, and it was killing their tourist attraction.
Oh yeah, there's like
So,
6 or 7 countries now that have banned it.
I
Um,
mean that goes to the against the point of we talked earlier in the podcast about they're not being inherently toxic, but I guess these oxybenzone compounds probably have a direct cytotoxicity in addition to endocrine disrupting function.
in water, yeah. If the animals are living, if they're living in oxybenzone soup and it's absorbing through their skin constantly, yeah, you see the toxic levels. It's just such a, it's just basically at that point it's well, the other thing is sea life, marine life has a shorter lifespan. There's certain organisms that they only live a few weeks or a few months or a year or whatever, so you can research their lifespan and their infertility a lot more than humans because it takes 100 years for us.
Yeah,
But for them, you can see it a lot quicker, so then they're quicker to respond because they are killing off the reefs with all this nonsense. Um, so yeah,
yeah,
that's another one I don't want to overlook. And of course, soy we talked about. Again, people can do soy if they want, but I everybody agrees it's estrogen. My opinion is we don't want more estrogen in our bodies. We're going to get a lot of estrogen as it is with the
yeah. And
artificial
look,
estrogen.
yeah, and there's so I mean the soy issue goes so deep, and I talked to Belinda Fecky on this podcast, and where you go all the way back to the origins of the pushing of soy in the food supply, and it started with John Harvey. Well, it started before John Harvey Kellogg. It started with
Mm,
Lena Cooper and the Seventh Day Adventists, who had a devout religious belief that eating animal meat and animal fat and animal products was going to arouse carnal passions and cause
hmm
people to pollute themselves alone in their bedrooms. So that's why they insisted that people eat soy and eat cereal and cornflakes.
hmm
So there's and now the soy industry is a massive
Yeah.
industrial agricultural behemoth, especially in the US, where of growing soy that requires the spraying of herbicides and pesticides that are going to be causing health issues. So, I mean, I guess that's another emphasis for the listener, which is there's so many interwoven harmful issues and incentives that is all built into this current system that we're existing in, and it takes an immense degree of intentionality in living and thinking to avoid it.
hmm Oh yeah, but it can be done. I mean, I do it, and I know a lot of people that do nowadays, and it makes a huge difference. Their blood test looks amazing, and it's not just their cholesterol, like all the doctors tend to focus on. The conventional doctors, it's their triglycerides are amazing, their blood sugar is amazing. Their hormones, their testosterone level for men are amazing, their estrogen, progesterone for women, amazing. The problem is a lot of the conventional doctors don't check male testosterone.
Mm,
Just unless you beg them to check it, they won't check it. And for women, they're not going to check your progesterone and estrogen unless you argue with them and say, "Hey, I want this check." So a lot of people don't realize their hormones are wacky or their hormones are good or whatever. But I track this stuff all the time. So I mean, basically, for the past few years, I've been doing DNA consulting, and I look at people's 23andMe and I look at their ancestry reports or whatever their DNA data that they have, and we go through their vulnerable spots and try and figure out just practical ways to fix those issues with the culture that we live in right now. So it's kind of like consulting slash coaching, right? And it does work, man. Like I talk to like 4 or 5 people every single day from different states, different countries, all over the world. It's super interesting. But the people that are consistent and that are working hard at this, they're much, much healthier. It has real life ramifications. It's not hopeless.
yeah. And so maybe we can quickly talk about some actionable advice. So you said avoiding synthetic care products and products
hmm
that obviously contain the ingredients such as phthalate, fragrance, perfume, which implies phthalate. anything that contains paraben or, as you said, methylparaben, anything with the paraben word in it. So
Hmm.
those are one big bunch of class of compounds, which is the care products.
Yeah.
Then you mentioned avoiding plastic contact with liquid and ideally plastic contact with foods. So I like to tell people to store their food in glass, drink out of glass or stainless steel if they have to,
Yeah.
cook in a stainless steel pan, cook out of a cast iron pan instead of a non-stick pan. What's your thought on those ceramic non-stick pans?
Ceramic is okay. Anytime the word non-stick gets added to it, that always makes me nervous. The ceramic part is fine. The
Mm,
non-stick part is when they're coating it with plastics, Teflons,
yeah.
and all kinds of shenanigans. But no, the actual ceramic is fine. Like sometimes people have Dutch ovens, which are just 100% ceramic. Those are great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
And enameled cookware is also a good option,
Hmm. Yep.
that avoids that.
Crock pots.
And
Yep. Hmm.
water filtration is and I guess water itself is quite a nuanced topic, but I think at a high level, charcoal filtering should remove most of these endocrine disruptors, if I'm not
Correct.
wrong.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Charcoal, carbon. Sometimes they call it carbon, but it's technically activated charcoal, but a lot of companies just call it carbon filters, and that's fine. But yeah, almost all of them have it, by the way. Like you can just get a standard Brita filter or something, just a standard water faucet filter. That's inexpensive, and it will have activated charcoal in there. So I
Mm.
encourage people to do that. You have to. You have to do that today in our culture. All the plastic piping, the water is piped through just to get to your house. That's a problem. And then they don't filter a lot of these chemicals out, so they get further concentrated at the municipal water supply level. Because they're good at killing viruses and bacteria, but they don't see it as a problem to have some of these plastic particles in the water. So you got to filter it out.
Yes.
You have to basically you have to take the responsibility into your own hands.
Yes, and I make that point that municipal water historically has been intended or optimized for removal of biological harm,
Hmm.
which is parasites, protozoa, bacteria,
Yep.
but they're not looking as fine with a fine tooth comb at herbicidal contaminants, or in some places that recycle their water, the presence of pharmaceutical drugs contaminating at trace
Hmm.
levels.
Oh yeah.
Um, well, on the while I've got you, I mean, on the topic of hormonal birth control, what's your take? I mean, if we're thinking about some of these endocrine disruptors, they have potential for increasing the risk of ectopic pregnancies and kind of premature ovarian failure. When you look at some of the data about BPA,
Hmm.
the synthetic estrogens don't seem to have those same type of risks. Maybe an increased risk of a small increased risk of breast cancer. What's your take on the synthetic therapeutic use of hormonal birth control, in terms of endocrine disrupting and health?
Yeah, it's genetic, right? I mean, some people, when I do DNA analysis, I'm just looking at SNPs, right? Like 23andMe has 700,000 SNPs. It's not trivial. It's a lot of data. And I have my own software to analyze this. So when I look at people's genetics, I'm actually looking at a whole panel of estrogen genes, like their estrogen receptor alpha genes and their estrogen receptor beta genes, right? Because alpha and beta are the two estrogen receptors, for example. And one of those is very positive and one's very negative in terms of activation. If you're hyperactivating your alpha receptor, you're going to have a lot of health problems. But again, I'm getting into the weeds, but this is more specific for you, Max, than your general audience. But the point is, you know, I look at people's genes, and if people have a long list of estrogen risk genes, meaning like breast cancer, ovarian cancer, just, estrogen dominance type of things where their progesterone is low and their estrogen's high, I find real problems with birth control, and that's what I see in real life. And those are the people that are, they really struggle with the weight gains from the birth control, or the depression from the birth control, or just all the side effects. The people that do
Mm,
fine are the ones with good estrogen genes. So you can't just lump everybody together. That's how they do a lot of studies, right? Is they just lump everybody together and say, oh, look, it's a 3% increased risk of breast cancer. It's like, well, yeah, but as a culture, we've increased our breast cancer risk 250% since 1980. And in other words, we're so saturated in all these estrogen chemicals. When you try and just study birth control, we're already washed out in all these other chemicals. You're not seeing the differences that you should see, right?
yes, Yeah,
So
no,
it's a person to
that
person difference.
that's a good point, and that's again that's a comment on the way research is done in today's day and age, where you take a very heterogeneous population who having massively different effects in different directions, but when you
Yeah,
average them all out, you get an average look at things that isn't necessarily going to identify the most people who responded the most.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's like
yeah,
if you're doing an Alzheimer's study and there's a small subset of people where their brain doesn't clear heavy metals very well. But if you just have a million people in a study, you're not going to pick that up. You're going to say, oh, heavy metals aren't a problem. But if you just pick out those people with that specific genetic risk and you look at them and then you measure their heavy metals like their mercury and their cobalt and chromium and cadmium or whatever, you're going to say, oh my gosh, like that really has an impact on their risk of Alzheimer's if you do a long enough term study. So yeah, like the SNPs are very powerful and they're underutilized because of the way the studies have been done historically, because there's kind of a tradition in science of just lumping everybody together and doing epidemiology that way. And
yes,
governments like that because it saves them a lot of money on medications and things, right? If you just do enough epidemiology, they save a lot of money when they have government run healthcare.
yes,
But it's kind of dated, right? It's kind of now that we have the capacity to look at people's individual genetic risks, it's much more valuable, and that's why I do it, right? Because you can understand your body so much better instead of just guessing and wondering what's going on.
yes, yes. Before we wrap it up, I just wanted to ask you another couple kind of niche questions. Are you aware of, we talked about cattle and feedlot fed cattle excreting atrazine if they're being fed commodity grains that is contaminated with atrazine residue. For those general reasons, I like to recommend people eat fully grass fed, regeneratively raised beef, or things like wild caught venison that is going to be basically the ruminant is eating its natural diet. Are you aware of bioaccumulation or bioconcentration of herbicides and other kind of chemicals in the adipose, the fat tissue of ruminants?
Um, yeah, I mean, yeah, for sure. I mean, it's even in animals that yes, but it's even in deer and things, because a lot of the deer are
Hmm.
eating atrazine sprayed corn. There's been some more recent concern about hunting because the idea is like, because me personally, I hunt, right?
Hmm.
In America, a lot of people hunt. It's kind of a tradition, especially because in my area, you can shoot unlimited deer. I can just keep buying more licenses and keep shooting deer.
Hmm.
And so I can literally shoot 100 if I want to and donate them to soup kitchens and things and feed homeless people.
Cool.
And I do some of that, but for the most part, I just use it for my own personal source of regenerative food. But then I try and hunt in areas. I go out of my way to hunt in areas that where the deer aren't just living in a cornfield, right?
Yes. Yes.
Because those ones have been shown to have higher levels of atrazine and things. But um, it's ironically not as well studied as a lot of the predators. Because the predators, of course, when you work it up the food chain, it gets more concentrated, and then when it's more concentrated, it's more the cancer causing doses and the doses that are causing actual toxicity, not just hormone
Yes.
disruption.
Yes, 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 yes. And look, we haven't even talked about glyphosate because I believe glyphosate, obviously, it's having its main negative effect by disrupting the shikimate pathway, which is a bacterial metabolism pathway.
Hmm.
But I believe it also has an endocrine disrupting effect in humans, other
Yeah.
than nuking your gut microbiome.
Yeah, it does. And in fact, I didn't write about that in my book, and I wish I would have because the research was so new when I was writing. I didn't realize it. And I had a hard time understanding why does glyphosate act like estrogen? It has an estrogenic impact too. Like if you look up soy and glyphosate and estrogen on PubMed or something, you're going to find a lot of studies. But it's and the molecule does not look anything like estrogen. But if you make it a dimer, if glyphosate, as you know, it chelates metals. It sticks to metals, right? Like
Mm,
zinc and magnesium and cobalt and chromium. And once it's linked to a metal, once it's chelated to a metal, it can form a dimer where there's two glyphosates on a single metal, and that starts to look like an estrogen. You see?
wow.
And so as a monomer, it kind of evaded me because I couldn't see it. I couldn't believe it was acting like estrogen because it just doesn't look like estrogen. You know what I mean? But as I
Mm.
recognize now, it's forming these multi-complex chelation complexes, and that's how it's triggering the estrogen receptor. And it's doing other things like it's an antibiotic, like you're saying. And there's a researcher from MIT, I forget her name, but um,
Stephanie Seneff.
Stephanie, yeah, she's pretty
Yeah.
famous because she's done a lot of research looking at glyphosate acting like glycine and actually incorporating
Mm.
into the ligaments and tissues in your joints where you have a lot of glycine. In fact, there's a study where they show that in animal ligaments, there's all this, like, there's a ton of glyphosate. And it's like, well, how does that it shouldn't be in even after you wash out the ligaments, it's built into the ligaments. Well, it's because it's
Wow.
replacing the glycine. So there's a lot of aspects to glyphosate that are real problematic besides just the estrogenic
Mm.
effect.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, that's a really deep conversation.
Hmm.
Are you before we wrap this up? And again, this is I'd like to get your thoughts on it. I interviewed Dr. Jack Cruz, who's very. I'm not sure if you're aware of
Sunshine.
his work.
Hmm.
He's very much talks about the impact of light in health
Hmm.
and describing a lot of uh, or ascribing a lot of the disruption in um, perhaps precocious puberty and other forms of reproductive harm to the light environment and excessive exposure to blue light. And I had a quick look at this, and not quick look at the I had a quick look at specific rat studies, and there was some good evidence that exposing rats to blue light environments did induce an earlier um, puberty. So, are you aware of the circadian effect of on fertility, is in addition to things like estrogen, like chemicals?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And lack of exercise alters your hormones, right? Like lack of magnesium, lack of minerals. There's so many aspects to it.
Mm,
And a
mm.
lot of people are getting hit by all of it, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, but at least the knowledge is out there, like that people that are kind of becoming more independent in their thinking and just listening to podcasts and educating themselves, you can go a long ways. It's very impressive how educated people are becoming
Mm.
independently. Um,
Yeah. I mean,
that's what you got to do.
the takeaway point is simply, and I like to use an ancestral lens, which is, adopt a lifestyle that's as much as possible that's free from the type of exposures that didn't exist when
Yep.
we evolved. And
Yep. Hmm.
blue light fits into that category, and atrazine, bisphenol A, phthalate, and diethylstilbestrol, and everything else also fits
Hmm.
into that category very strongly. So
Exactly.
yeah,
A good philosophy. No, that's the
yeah,
way to do it. That's exactly what I talk about in my book too. I mean,
yeah.
if you guys
Well,
weren't doing it,
uh,
it's probably your gut bacteria probably aren't going to recognize it. Your body, your genetics is not going to be adapted to it.
yeah. Look, I'm really fascinated, and I really appreciate all your work, Anthony. I think this is such an emerging and under talked about field, and maybe even the interaction of herbicides and the effect that these industrial herbicide contamination of the human food supply, I think is another emerging field that's going to get more recognition in the next decade. But yeah, really appreciate you coming on. I really think maybe we need to do another episode where we can go into the weeds a little bit of the each classes, because we talked about pesticides, phthalates, parabens, and BPA, but we didn't really talk about PFAS, the perfluoral and polyfluoroalkyl substances. We haven't talked about the endocrine disrupting effect of heavy metals. So there's a lot we actually haven't talked about that I'd like to get your thoughts on. So maybe I could get you on again sometime.
Yeah, thanks, Max. Appreciate it. And yeah, well, and I'm impressed with your knowledge of all this stuff and the terms and everything else too. Most people, they're not nearly as familiar with it as you are, so that makes it more interesting. And hopefully, we didn't lose too many people talking about
Yeah,
some of the technical stuff.
yeah. If you to the listeners, if you made it this far, then well done. We got a little bit technical at the end, but I've had some burning questions on my mind for probably a couple of years now, so
Mhm.
I got
Yeah,
them
man.
out today. But yeah, we'll have to talk again. So yeah, thank
Thanks,
you
man.
so much, Anthony. I really appreciate your time.
All right, take care.
Cool.